Catholic Echo podcast is produced by the Communications Department of the Diocese of Youngstown, with support from the Annual Diocesan Appeal. Bishop David Bonner and members of our diocesan community discuss your burning spiritual questions. It can be found on CatholicEcho.org, Facebook, and YouTube. Your host is Dennis Biviano.
Hello and welcome to the Catholic Echo podcast. This is part 3 of a 3-part series on the principles of Catholic social teaching, released in 1891 by Pope Leo XIII. We are joined again by the Diocesan Director of Peace and Justice, R.J. Mangan. Thanks as always for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
We conclude this discussion with the hardest word to pronounce of the 3, subsidiarity. How is this term defined by Catholic social teaching?
So yes, subsidiarity, which might sound interestingly enough similar to a word people are familiar with, subsidy.
Yes.
Right? So the federal government provides subsidies to different organizations. Interestingly enough, subsidiarity comes from, once again, that dropping down low to a lower level. But fundamentally, and this is the definition I pull from the Fondazione Centesimus Annus Pro Pontifice, long name, I know, it's an institution at the Catholic University of America.
But you pronounced it perfectly, but go ahead.
Thank you. But from them, subsidiarity means that decisions in society need to be made at the lowest competent level. Number 2, that problems are best solved at the level where they arise, as long as that's possible. And thirdly, any activity that can be efficaciously performed by a more decentralized entity should be. So actually, in a certain way, you could actually call it the grassroots principle, that where a problem shows up or where rules and laws are being made, they should always be taking into consideration, first and foremost, the people who it impacts, right? Or for another example, you could say, how the United States is run. We have local laws, and then you have county laws, and then you have state laws, and then you have federal laws, right? And if there's a local problem, well, we shouldn't necessarily make an entire state law over a local problem. If there's a local issue, then, the town of Massillon or the city of Youngstown should probably solve their problem first. Unless, of course, that's not possible for them to do that.
Yes.
But the same principle applies to the churches, to the Catholic Church as a whole. And this is part of the respect and the deference given to the offices of the priest, the bishop, and the cardinals and the pope. That when there's a problem in your parish, you and the person who you have a problem with should be the first ones to solve that issue. And then only if you can't do that should you probably involve your pastor to try to bring you two together. Now, let's say the pastor has an issue in his parish that he can't resolve. Well, that's when he goes up to the bishop, and so on and so forth, right? And if the bishop finds that he can't answer a problematic question or solve a problem within his diocese, that's when he can go to his brother bishops at the United States Conference, and so on and so forth, right? This is how, something that might be a local issue, well, then you raise up the question, how can we solve it here? And that's how you can kind of get those local answers to national problems, because usually issues that show up on the ground level aren't a singular, right?
Now, in face value, it seems like common sense, but, at the time, was this new Catholic social teaching, was it controversial? Was it embraced?
Actually, it was interesting because at the time, it was not controversial for the democratic societies of the time, but for those that were still monarchical, for those that still had empires, such as Germany and the British Empire, and for France's overseas territories as well, even though they weren't necessarily imperial, they very much acted in that capacity, was this idea that you should respect the lower levels of society to solve their own problems, right? That was a bit surprising to come from the Pope, of all people, at the time. But it was an interesting admonition of actually the state itself, because as we've been talking about in this series, Pope Leo XIII was responding to socialism as a new ideology. Socialism wanted to put all of the power of all decisions in the state, right? And when we say the state, we really mean in some level of government. Well, Pope Leo XIII is saying, why should the government get involved in a disagreement between two friends unless absolutely necessary?
Yes.
And it's kind of the protection of people's liberty and freedom to really fully be themselves.
Well, an obvious tie in modern society is immigration and crime.
Actually, can you expand on that?
Immigration, how it's handled on a local level, how it's handled in the state and national level. Crime, the same sort of concept.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with what you mean there. That when it comes to immigration specifically and crime itself, although these aren't inherently connected topics, but There's crimes that can be handled on a local level, and there's crimes that cannot be handled on a local level. And actually, in a certain sense, there's a state crime, or there might be something that's only illegal in your local area or in your county. A fantastic example of this would actually be prohibition, and the fact that there are still dry counties here in the United States, especially in Utah, where the sale, possession, and distribution of alcohol is completely illegal. That once was applied to the whole nation, and that was realized to be a very poor idea. And so it was resolved to be passed back down to the states and to the counties. And so the counties that wish to remain dry may do so. Whereas immigration, on the other hand, you look at that and you say, can states handle this, or is this something that the federal government has to handle? And when it comes to the national borders, right, then it's something very obviously that's supposed to be in the hands of the federal government. That immigration is not something that a county or even a state should inherently be making laws about. And actually, this goes back to kind of the foundation of the country, that states can't have treaties with foreign governments because that's the proper power of the national government.
Yes.
And that's why immigration falls under the power of the executive and of the Department of the State. That we as well, on the lower orders of society, should have respect for the authority of the higher orders of society, that we need to align ourselves with the rule of law on all levels.
So do you believe it's more about efficiency or about respecting human dignity and freedom?
It is absolutely about respecting human dignity and freedom. Efficiency is only a modern virtue. It is never a virtue in the Catholic social teaching. Granted, when things have become so inefficient that they're causing second-order problems, then yes, that's something to be addressed. But nothing should ever be made so efficient that it completely runs over and chews up the human persons who it was originally supposed to serve. Mm-hmm. You can look at a number of situations that currently exist in the United States. I mean, look at the healthcare system and the struggles that people have with that. You can look at the housing. You can look at the criminal justice system and how it may not have served folks the best because of the fact that local judges can't make the best local decisions. Things like mandatory minimum sentencing really removed a lot of power from local judges to be able to address somebody who they may have come into their court multiple times, and they might have a better local solution for that problem, rather than having a national or state solution imposed down below. So yes, it's absolutely for the protection of human dignity and liberty. And efficiency has never done anything to ensure that those are protected, I suppose.
How would subsidiarity influence the church's own structure and authority? You touched on it a little bit, but can you give us an example of how they would face that these days?
Oh yeah, absolutely. That, let's say there is a problem happening at a parish or at a local church. Through subsidiarity, the bishop is going to have respect for a pastor to take care of that parish first and foremost, right? So that, let's say the people of a parish go to the bishop about a problem. What's the first thing the bishop's probably going to ask? Did you talk to your pastor about that? Mm-hmm. And if he didn't, then he's going to go talk to your pastor about that, because it's part of subsidiarity. And let's jump to the Vatican, right? If the people of America, or there are a number of American Catholics who were to write a letter to Pope Leo XIV, or any of the popes, that there's this problem going on in our country, or there's this problem that we recognize may be happening on the globe, he would first ask, did you talk to your bishop about this? Did you send a letter to the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops first? Did you bring this up to them first? Because that's not only respect for the authority of the priest and then of the bishops, of the local bishops, that's also respect for the sensus fidei, as it's called, the sense of the faithful. It's respect for the ability of the faithful themselves to come up with the solutions which they can then provide to their pastor, which they can provide to their bishop, right?
Well, it's a good time to take a short break. Much more to come when the Catholic Echo podcast returns. It's time for Patron Saints of the Diocese of Youngstown with your Bishop, David J. Bonner.
St. Catherine of Siena was a mystic born in Siena, Italy in 1347. She had frequent visions of Christ, Mary, angels, and the saints. As a teen, she entered the Third Order of St. Dominic and later started a monastery for women. She cared for the sick in hospitals and homes and buried the dead, including victims of the Black Plague. She corresponded with many leaders seeking reconciliation between warring parties, including a schism over the legitimate pope. Her letters and book, Dialogue of Divine Providence, led to her recognition as a doctor of the Church in 1970. She is a patron saint of Italy, Europe, nurses, firefighters, and is invoked against miscarriages in fire. She is also patron of St. Catherine of Siena Parish, with 2 worship sites in Boardman, Ohio. Her feast day is April 29th. So happy feast day of St. Catherine of Siena to our friends in Boardman. St. Catherine of Siena, pray for us.
Did you know that the Catholic Echo magazine is delivered 10 times per year to 52,000 Catholic households in northeastern Ohio? That's more than 150,000 people. And the Catholic Echo website, catholicecho.org, has been averaging 30,000 views per month since it launched in February 2023. Advertise your business, special event, or service with the Catholic Echo in print or online. Email catholicecho@youngstowndiocese.org. Advertising discounts are available for Catholic institutions as well as for businesses that commit to 5 or 10 issues in a year. Email catholicecho@youngstowndiocese.org or visit the advertising tab at catholicecho.org for more information.
Welcome back to the Catholic Echo podcast as we resume our conversation on Catholic social teaching with R.J. Mangan. R.J., I wanted to ask you, last time didn't get around to it, can we talk a little bit about Pope Leo XIV's inspiration behind choosing his name?
Absolutely. Although I haven't seen anything from him specifically saying, this is why I chose this name. I don't think it's any surprise to anyone from what he's already been speaking about. And really, actually, if you look back at his first prayer to the people of Rome and to the whole Catholic Church when he first stepped out, saying, to all of you brothers and sisters of Rome, of Italy, to the whole world, we want to be a church of the synod, a church that walks, a church that always seeks peace, that always seeks charity, that always seeks to be close, especially to those who suffer. Leo XIV, I believe, is absolutely taking inspiration from Leo XIII in, number one, challenging modern social issues, challenging political leaders, challenging us to be directly involved in our political climate, challenging us to be directly involved in making our lives more moral, and not just making our own lives, but making the world around us, a more moral place to live, to encourage morality and truth, justice, virtues in different aspects of life. But not just that, but that coming back to subsidiarity, this idea that, this is a church that builds bridges, dialogue, always open to receive, like St. Peter's Basilica Square with its open arms, all who need our charity, our presence, our dialogue, and our love.
What do you think Pope Leo XIII would say about the role of global organizations today in terms of subsidiarity?
First and foremost, I think, Leo XIII would probably say that they all should be listening to the Pope. Which I think that's actually a pretty darn good piece of advice, that listening to the Vatican and listening, actually not just the Vatican, but listening to the Catholic Church, listening to the voices of morality, listening to the voice, to the Vicar of Christ, to help lead, these global organizations on a path of justice. But not just that these global organizations have to have respect for the sovereignty of peoples. They have to have respect for the independence and the freedom and liberty of peoples. World organizations should not make sweeping decisions without very, very careful consideration, long deliberation, and really sincere gobs and reams of data on such subjects. That global organizations, should they be making any sanctions or laws, or really just even initiatives, need to take into consideration the whole world. Because if you're going to make something that's supposed to apply to everybody, literally on the planet, then it's going to take a whole heck of a lot of work.
Are you a believer in what we keep hearing about the revival of the Catholic Church? Do you see that? Have you seen that?
I have. I've seen, at least specifically, the revival of the American Catholic Church in some ways. We've been seeing a lot more young people come in than we've been seeing before. I hear, actually very specifically from Gen Z, and especially even from a little bit younger, those kids who are in high school right now, who, believe it or not, I suppose they're Gen Alpha, which is making me start to feel ancient, but they are hungry for spiritual nourishment. They are hungry for spiritual truths, because so much of our world has said, The world's what you make of it. The meaning of human life is whatever you determine. Or, as Casey versus Planned Parenthood like to say, it's the core of liberty to determine for oneself the concept of existence, which anybody who even studies math in natural sciences says that's ridiculous. There's laws, there's truth. They want objective truth. They want someone to be preaching the gospel wholeheartedly and with no fear, with real zeal. On one hand, I do pray that some of the zeal of our young folks is tempered by the grace of wisdom in what they do, but nonetheless that they do still remain zealous for the faith, that they do remain zealous for the truth, that they are really seeking out something that previous generations, at least my own and the one preceding mine, kind of gave up on in some ways. They want to be affiliated, right? Mm-hmm. It's almost like we're having a pendulum swing us back the other way, where people, and especially nowadays with digital isolation, with, as I like to say, we have never been able to talk to each other easier, and we've never been more afraid to say hello to our neighbor.
Yeah. Isn't that scary? But it's important, I think, that Gen Z really, keep these Catholic social teachings alive.
Yes, absolutely. And it's so important for them to have a fruitful discussion as to why these principles exist and to really pursue that. St. Anselm of Canterbury had a phrase that I love. He said, doubt leads to inquiry, inquiry leads to truth, and the truth will set you free. That's one version of it. Another one is that truth shall bring you into the faith, because God is truth. God is love. Mm-hmm. And by finding truth, you shall find God.
Are there any resources available online where folks can find out more about Catholic social teaching?
Yes, absolutely. I would highly recommend capp-usa.org. That is the Centesimus Annus Pro Pontifice Foundation with Catholic University of America. And once again, I'll say their name. It's the Fondazione Centesimus Annus Pro Pontifice. That's the fancy name. It's capp-usa.org. And they have a really fantastic series on Catholic social teaching in all its aspects.
And how about any books from that era around when the Catholic social teaching came out in 1891 that interest you?
Yes. Shortly after Pope Leo XIII was writing during early 1900s, I highly recommend reading some of the newspapers from the Catholic Workers Movement here in the United States with Dorothy Day. I highly recommend looking at the work and teachings of the Catholics of that time period because of the fact that they were intimately close to the experiences of the poor, because the Catholics were the poor in the turn of the century.
Yes.
It was the Italians, the Irish, and the Germans who'd come over and were being mistreated in these foundries and factories. But not just that. I think it's actually necessary for us to encounter books like Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto, because it's only by understanding them that we can properly counter them. It's only by actually understanding the theories of socialism and communism that you can actually adequately argue against them. As for myself, I would always suggest that those are given to people who are already wise and rational, or at least you're guided through them. Because yes, they can be very convincing to young folks. The amount of teenagers who come out as communists or whatever, and they want to be a radical tanky or so on and so forth. What the important thing is actually, like reading the book of Keynes and Maynard Keynes, by the way, which is supposedly the actual system on which United States capitalism is built. Read the work of Maynard Keynes. You do need to read some economics nowadays, no matter how boring and dry it might seem. And reading that in combination with the scripture and in tandem with the writings of the saints, especially Pope St. John Paul II, because his pontificate, I feel, was the greatest reaction to and a final answer to things like the evils of socialism and of communism within the world, and also responding to things like fascism and dictatorships, and fundamentally responding to the failures of capitalism itself, because there's no such thing as a perfect economic system.
Yes.
If there were, then we'd probably already have put it in place by now. At least you'd imagine so over the course of human history. And if there is truly a perfect one where everybody is happy, then I assure you that it is no longer earth and we must be in heaven.
As the Diocesan Director of Peace and Justice, what are you looking forward to most this year in the diocese? Does someone like you set goals?
Yes, of course. Trying to reach out there into the parishes and to our ministers, try to bring education to them, bringing the prayers and not just teaching about Catholic social teaching, but also, promoting the Catholic Campaign for Human Development. Of course, promoting the Rice Bowl, which I'm always thankful to everybody who participates. That's, our yearly campaign. Help support both overseas and at home. Just as a reminder, the Rice Bowl collection does keep 25% here in the diocese that's helped support our Catholic Charities agencies, some of our food banks, and some of our parish community dinners and the like. Outside of that, of course, is the Voice of Hope coming up for us as Catholic Charities, and various other campaigns which you will be able to read about and hear about at ccdoy.org.
Thank you for including that. I appreciate it. That was going to be my last question. RJ, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Dennis. It's been great.
Now that concludes our series on Catholic social teachings. I am Pope Leo XIII. You can find us on YouTube, Facebook, CatholicEcho.org, or your favorite podcasting platform. And on behalf of the rest of the communications team, thanks for listening and have a blessed week.
The Catholic Echo podcast is a production of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Youngstown. Have a blessed day, and may God be with you.